Before the first shots were fired, before the first treaty was signed, something far more devastating had already swept across this continent. By the time Europeans recorded their earliest encounters, up to 90% of Native Americans were already gone. The loss was so vast, so sudden, and so quiet that later generations struggled to understand what had happened. It was not war. It was not soldiers. It was not the kind of conquest usually found in history books. The force that reshaped the fate of Native America was something older and invisible. It moved without warning, passing from village to village, and left behind silence where communities once lived. Families vanished. Nations faded. Villages that had been alive for centuries stood empty, their fields overtaken by the wind. The true force that changed this land was disease. These illnesses entered a world with no inherited immunity, no history of exposure, and no natural defenses. When they struck, the impact was unlike anything recorded in human history. In some areas, only a few survived long enough to bury the dead. In others, the sudden loss of elders, leaders, and children shattered cultural foundations and left entire peoples vulnerable to everything that followed. This documentary explores the 5 deadliest epidemics that nearly erased Native America. 5 diseases that shaped the population of a continent long before gunfire echoed across the plains or treaties were written on parchment. These epidemics were silent, relentless, and far more destructive than any army that ever marched across North America. To understand why these diseases were so unstoppable, we must return to the moment before contact. A moment when Native America was thriving, strong in number, rich in culture, and completely unprepared for the biological storm that was about to arrive. Before the first epidemics reached the shores of North America, the indigenous nations of this continent lived in a world that was biologically separate from the rest of the globe. For thousands of years, Native Americans had no exposure to the pathogens that circulated across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their immune systems had never encountered illnesses like smallpox, measles, or influenza. Without even knowing it, entire nations stood on the edge of a danger they could not see. A major reason for this vulnerability was the difference in domesticated animals. In the Old World, people lived in close contact with cattle, pigs, horses, and other large animals. Diseases often jumped from these animals to humans, and over generations, the immune systems of those populations slowly adapted. In the Americas, the situation was completely different. Native peoples did not live with large herd animals, and they did not face the same kinds of zoonotic diseases. As a result, they passed through history without building resistance to the viruses that had shaped the lives and bodies of Europeans for centuries. Despite this biological isolation, Native America before 1492 was far from empty or fragile. It was a place full of life. Scholars estimate that between 50 and 100 million people lived here. Powerful confederacies governed vast regions. Cities rose along river valleys. Pueblo communities built complex settlements in the southwest. Agricultural societies fed large populations and traded across great distances. These were healthy, organized, and thriving civilizations. But isolation had a hidden cost. It meant that when Old World diseases finally appeared, they entered a continent with no defenses. Historians use the term virgin soil epidemics to describe what happened next. It refers to diseases striking a population with no prior exposure. The results were immediate and catastrophic. First contact often meant extremely high mortality. Entire villages could fall within weeks. Some communities lost so many people in a single season that there were not enough survivors to care for the sick or bury the dead. This was the world on the eve of disaster, a world full of strength, but biologically unprepared for what was coming. And the first blow arrived in the form of one of the most feared viruses of the ancient world, a virus known for its ability to destroy entire nations, smallpox. Smallpox was the single most destructive force to ever strike Native America. No other disease matched its reach, its speed, or its ability to erase entire communities. For Native peoples who had no previous exposure to this virus infection, meant facing a mortality rate that could reach 50 to 90%. It spread through breath and touch. It traveled on clothing, on blankets, and on trade goods. Once it entered a community, there was almost nothing that could stop it. Survivors remembered it as the white ghost disease because of the pale scars it left behind and the way it moved through the land like a spirit of death. The first major outbreak linked to European contact began in the 1520s. The virus arrived in central Mexico through an enslaved man who carried the infection. When it entered the Aztec capital, it burned through the population with incredible speed. Thousands died within weeks. The disease moved faster than the Spanish army and did more damage than any weapon they carried. With leaders dead, healers overwhelmed, and entire districts losing most of their residents, the Aztec Empire was left unable to resist. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not only a military defeat, it was the direct outcome of a biological disaster that struck at the heart of a powerful society. More than a century later, smallpox continued to rage across North America. In 1633 and 1634, it struck the coastal and inland regions of New England and the Great Lakes. The Wampanoag, Narragansett, Massachusetts, and Iroquois all suffered enormous losses. Many communities lost half of their people in a matter of months. Entire villages disappeared. Some nations lost so many elders and leaders that their political structures collapsed. When English colonists later expanded into the region, they moved into lands that had been depopulated by disease rather than defeated in battle. Through the 18th century, smallpox returned again and again. These were not isolated incidents. They came in repeated cycles that followed trade networks and river routes. The virus traveled with traders, merchants, and explorers moving farther into the interior each time. Plains nations, forest nations, and communities along the northern rivers all experienced waves of sickness that reshaped their demographic and political landscape. Some tribes attempted to quarantine, but the virus often reached them before they even knew an outbreak existed. Then came the catastrophic epidemic of 1837 along the Missouri River, one of the worst biological disasters in North American history. The virus arrived on a steamboat and quickly spread from trading posts into native communities. For the Mandan, it was nearly the end. Their population dropped from about 2,000 to around 125. The Hidatsa and Arikara also suffered devastating losses. In the space of a single summer, three powerful nations that had shaped the northern plains for generations were nearly erased. The impact of smallpox went far beyond the immediate death toll. The loss of elders meant the loss of oral history, traditional knowledge, and cultural memory. The death of warriors weakened political alliances and reduced the ability of nations to defend their homelands. The death of children left gaps in future generations. In some cases, the survivors were forced to join with neighboring tribes because there were not enough people left to maintain independent communities. Smallpox also played a major role in how European expansion unfolded. Settlers often encountered lands where native populations had already been devastated. What appeared to be unclaimed or lightly inhabited territory was in reality the aftermath of an epidemic that had swept through years or decades earlier. This mistaken impression significantly shaped the narratives that later appeared in history books. Smallpox was the single most destructive epidemic in Native American history. It changed demographics, cultural structures, and political power across a continent. It was an invisible force that moved ahead of armies and created openings that Europeans later occupied. And although it did not erase Native America, it left wounds that shaped generations. But smallpox was only the beginning. Another airborne killer was waiting, one that struck the youngest members of native communities and carved deep losses into the next generation. Measles was different from smallpox in the way it spread and in the people it targeted. While smallpox could strike anyone, measles often hit the youngest first. It was one of the most contagious viruses in the world. In communities with no immunity, a single infection could move through an entire village in a matter of days. Among native children, the mortality rate was often between 20 and 40%. Families watched their sons and daughters fall sick with fever and coughing, followed by a rapid decline that left little time to respond. The first major wave recorded in North America occurred in 1618 and 1619, sweeping across the New England coast, just before large-scale European settlement began. Entire coastal communities were emptied or left with only a handful of survivors. Many villages that had stood for generations lost most of their children in a single season. This tragedy unfolded before the Pilgrims expanded inland, and it created a landscape changed not by war, but by disease. Early colonists later interpreted the absence of large native populations as a sign of open land, when in reality it was the result of an epidemic that had devastated the region. During the 18th and 19th centuries, measles continued to move along trade and travel routes, reaching the Pacific Northwest. The Haida Tlingit and many other coastal nations experienced repeated outbreaks. These communities relied on interconnected clan systems, large extended families, and the stability of shared cultural roles. When measles swept through, it struck precisely where these societies were most vulnerable. Children and adolescents who formed the core of future clan leadership and ceremonial responsibilities were lost in large numbers. Some villages suffered multiple outbreaks across 2 or 3 decades, each one cutting into the next generation before it had a chance to grow. The plains were not spared. As horses trade goods and travel linked the interior of the continent, measles traveled with them. Outbreaks moved from camp to camp in waves. A single outbreak could reduce an entire birth generation.
It is time for
the demographic impact was severe. With fewer children surviving to adulthood, population growth slowed or reversed. Families that relied on large extended networks became smaller and less stable. The loss of even one generation weakened the ability of tribes to recover from later challenges, whether political, military, or environmental. The long-term consequences of measles were deep. The death of children meant more than the tragedy of young lives lost. It meant the loss of cultural continuity. In many native nations, oral tradition was passed on through careful instruction from elders to young people. Stories, songs, ceremonial duties, and community roles had to be learned through guidance and daily participation. When so many children died, those teachings were interrupted. Some knowledge survived only in fragments. Some languages began to lose speakers. Entire clans found themselves without the younger members who would have carried their identity into the next generation. Families and kinship systems also suffered. Grief spread through households generation after generation. The emotional toll weakened communities already facing pressure from colonization, displacement, and the arrival of new diseases. In many oral histories, the period marked by repeated measles outbreaks is remembered as a time when the future itself felt uncertain. Measles did not erase native nations, but it carved a permanent gap into their demographic story. It took the youngest, the ones who were meant to inherit the duties of their people. And as devastating as these losses were, the next epidemic would prove even more dangerous for entire families, especially during the coldest months of the year. If measles took the children, influenza came for everyone. The next chapter in this history unfolds in winter. Influenza struck native communities in a way that was shaped not only by the virus itself, but by the conditions in which people were forced to live. Unlike smallpox or measles, The flu did not always kill by the sheer power of the pathogen. Its deadliest moments came when it combined with hunger, freezing temperatures, and the hardships created by displacement. During the winter months, when food supplies ran low and shelter was limited, influenza could spread through entire families in a matter of days. Winter lodges, crowded cabins, and later government camps created the perfect environment for the virus to move quickly from person to person. The Trail of Tears, which began in 1831, shows how deadly influenza could become under these conditions. Thousands of Cherokee people were forced to march west, often with little food, inadequate clothing, and almost no protection from the cold. Influenza and pneumonia followed them throughout the journey. Families slept in makeshift shelters or out in the open. Illness moved freely through the camps, striking the young, the old, and everyone weakened by exhaustion and hunger. By the end of the relocation, an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 Cherokee had died, many from the flu and respiratory infections, made worse by exposure to winter weather. A similar tragedy unfolded during the Long Walk of the Navajo in 1864. More than 8,000 Navajo were forced to travel hundreds of miles to the Bosque Redondo reservation. The march itself was brutal, with people suffering from hunger, fatigue, and constant fear. Influenza spread among the captives as they moved, and the death toll continued to rise even after they reached the reservation. Living conditions at Bosque Redondo were harsh. There was little wood for fires, the shelter was poor, and food was scarce. Influenza thrived in these circumstances, killing many who had already survived the march. It became a seasonal threat that returned each winter, taking lives again and again. For many Native nations, influenza was not a single catastrophic event, but a repeating burden. Long before modern medical care reached reservations, winter brought a familiar cycle of illness. Every year, outbreaks weakened communities already struggling with poverty and the loss of traditional lands. Children, elders, and anyone with limited food or warmth were especially at risk. Some families lost members year after year, and entire villages carried the memory of winters marked by sickness and funerals. Influenza did not always strike with the sudden devastation of smallpox or the generational impact of measles, but its repetition made it one of the most relentless killers on the continent. It moved with the seasons, returned whenever conditions worsened, and often arrived at the exact moment when Native people were least able to resist it. Unlike the sudden blow of influenza, the next disease killed slowly, taking its victims over months and years. It did not arrive in a single season. It settled in and stayed. The next chapter in this story is the rise of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis became one of the most persistent and devastating threats to Native American communities, not because it struck quickly, but because it stayed for generations. Unlike smallpox or influenza, which announced themselves with sudden waves of sickness, tuberculosis moved quietly. It settled into communities that were already weakened by displacement and loss, and it remained there year after year. The spread of tuberculosis accelerated after 1850, when many Native nations were forced onto reservations. These reservations were not only unfamiliar lands, but environments that created ideal conditions for the disease. Overcrowding was common. Families were pushed into small houses where ventilation was poor and space was limited. Malnutrition became widespread as traditional food sources were taken away, and rations provided by the government were often inadequate. Winters were harsh, and many homes offered little protection from cold or damp air. Tuberculosis thrives in these conditions, and it began to spread steadily through Native communities across the West. The toll on the population was severe. Native Americans suffered mortality rates 3 to 5 times higher than those of European settlers. Tuberculosis rarely struck all at once. Instead, it moved slowly through households, claiming lives over months or even years. It killed adults more often than children, which made its impact even more damaging. Adults were the cultural, economic, and spiritual anchors of their communities. They were the ones who held knowledge of ceremonies, governance, hunting, farming, and the stories that carried identity from one generation to the next. Every death left a gap that could not easily be filled. The long-term effects were profound. Tuberculosis created a pattern of multi-generational decline. Some tribes lost large portions of their working-age population, which weakened their ability to maintain social structures or resist outside pressures. The loss of elders was equally harmful because these were the people who served as teachers, advisors, and caretakers of tradition. Entire branches of cultural memory were lost as oral teachings went unpassed. Many communities describe the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a time when the fabric of their culture felt thin, stretched by constant grief and continuous illness. Tuberculosis remained a major cause of death for Native Americans well into the 20th century. Even as medical treatments improved, reservations continued to struggle with poor housing, poverty, and limited access to health care. The disease did not move with dramatic waves, but it haunted Native families across decades, leaving scars that were quieter than smallpox or measles, but just as real. But there was one more killer waiting in the story of these epidemics, a disease that did not creep slowly, but struck with terrifying speed. It was swift, merciless, and carried by the rivers. Cholera brought a different kind of terror to Native communities. Unlike diseases that lingered for weeks or months, cholera could kill within hours. A person who seemed healthy in the morning could be gone by nightfall. The rapid loss of fluids caused by the disease led to sudden dehydration, collapsing the body before families had time to understand what was happening. Communities that had survived waves of smallpox, measles, and influenza now faced an illness that moved faster than anything they had experienced before. The rivers that connected Native nations through trade and travel became pathways for the disease. As steamboats and traders moved along major waterways, cholera followed. It traveled with contaminated drinking water, infected clothing, and even the hands of those who unknowingly carried the bacteria. For nations living along the Missouri River, the outbreak that began in 1849 was one of the most devastating events in their recorded history. Between 1849 and 1851, cholera swept through the Ponca, Omaha, Otoe, Osage, and Kansa. Villages that had stood for generations were emptied in a matter of days. Some communities lost entire families. Others lost the majority of their population before help could arrive. The disease struck so quickly that there was often no time to treat the sick or bury the dead. Survivors later described villages where the only sound was the river moving past homes that no longer had anyone living inside them. The trauma of those years left a deep mark on cultural memory. Many tribes referred to cholera as the Dead River Sickness, a name that reflected both its speed and its connection to the waterways that had long supported life. Stories were passed down about nights when the disease moved through a single lodge and left no one alive by dawn. Families recalled watching relatives fall ill, weaken, and pass away all within the span of a single day. These memories shaped how later generations viewed the rivers that had once been central to trade, travel, and survival. Cholera was not as widespread as smallpox or as persistent as tuberculosis, but its sudden impact was unforgettable. It reminded Native communities that illness could arrive without warning and take everything in a single night. The shock of those years remained long after the outbreaks ended. These 5 diseases reshaped the continent. They altered population, culture, and the balance of power in North America. But they did not erase its first peoples. Native nations endured, carried their traditions forward, and rebuilt in the face of losses that would have destroyed many other societies. When we look back across the history of Native America, one truth becomes clear. The greatest population collapse in the Americas was not caused by war. It was caused by disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, and cholera reshaped the continent long before armies marched or borders were drawn. These epidemics changed the balance of power, erased entire villages, and disrupted cultural lines that had been carried for centuries. They were forces that moved silently across the land and left an imprint that can still be felt in the historical record. Yet the story does not end with loss. Despite the devastation, Native nations survived. Families rebuilt their communities. Elders preserved knowledge and passed it on. Languages that once faced extinction have been revived in classrooms and cultural programs. Ceremonies continue to be practiced. Identity remains strong. Across the continent, Native people have held on to their stories, their sovereignty, and their traditions, even after facing what may be the most severe biological disaster in human history. The survival of Native America is a testament to resilience that cannot be measured by numbers alone. It lives in the continuity of culture, in the memory of ancestors, and in the determination of each new generation. These epidemics nearly erased the first peoples of this land, but they did not succeed. What endured is stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it.